Okay, so I'm going to talk about knowledge preservation. And right off, I'm going to shift the discussion from reproducibility to something more like reuse, because I think reuse gets at trying to get the best science and the most science out of all the data that we have. Reproducibility is a side benefit, but putting that in as the major focus of the effort to do all this stuff doesn't seem to be anything that excites anyone. And so I'd like to acknowledge my partners in crime from these various institutions here on some of the projects that I'll talk about. So the problem that we have is demonstrated here in this slide, was published in Nature a few years ago. And not surprisingly, the longer you go after a publication, the less likely it is to find a data set that was involved in that publication. So it's clear that entropy takes over and we lose data if we're not careful. But the point is that we have a huge investment, if you look at the LHC, for example, in producing this giant scientific data set. If we flush it, then that investment, in some sense, is wasted if the data set is not fully exploited. Again, if we want to talk about reproducibility, which I really don't, then it's crucial to have this preservation of the data and the knowledge around it. And so this is driving many funding agencies, nations, European communities and such to talk about, well, we have to keep all this data and we want to make it public too. And so the real question then is, how do we respond? This is a mandate from whatever, pick your favorite international or national organization. And so, but this raises a whole host of policy questions, which is what I'd like to start with. So what data should you save? What else do you need to save to make the data reusable? Where do you store it? Who pays for the storage? Well, you know, most of us have federal grants. They only last 3 years. What do we do with them? How do we pay for this after the money is spent? And then if we're having public access, who pays for that? Because that's not free either. And so funding agencies are developing policies, and it's not really clear, sorry if I offend any funding agency people in the room, that they're getting guidance from the communities. And so one of the things that I want to tell you about briefly is an exercise that was funded by the NSF, which was to poll the math and physical sciences community about these questions. And so this was a community exercise with workshops. We had feedback from the APS, the American Chemical Society, and various other organizations within the math and physical sciences. And we just issued a final report. And so some of the conclusions, which I'm not really going to dwell on, but the community thought that it would be a really good idea if there were machine-readable data linked to publications. And you'd be surprised at how many fields don't have that as the norm. It is also clear that many disciplines have many ideas on how data should be shared and reused, and so that this should be a discipline-specific policy discussion if you're going to have policy. There's always a cost-benefit analysis. We know that it's completely impractical to make the raw data from the entire LHC available to the public because no one could use it. However, if you want to make LHC data public, where do you draw the line in terms of what's useful and what's not? And then if you want to move the community towards this paradigm of open access and reuse, it's better to have carrots than sticks. Okay, so you might argue that these conclusions are relatively obvious, but I think that another aspect of this report that you might find interesting was a very long discussion about what is necessary to make data reusable. And so I'd just like to list that. So the additional information, in addition to the data, you need all these other things. You need application software, you need workflows. You need to basically document what you did in a way that is discoverable. And then you need the cyber infrastructure to store and discover and access it. And then you need to convince people that this is worthwhile. So that's where the incentives come in. And I won't talk any more about that in this presentation, but you can look at the report. So for the rest of the talk, what I'd like to do is to explore these aspects of policy and some of the work that's being done in various aspects of this problem. So let's start with the data. So you can think of this as simply backing up your hard drive. And I claim that this is easy because we sort of know how to do this. As long as you can migrate the data from one format to another, this is something that one can do. The hard part is actually the software that's behind it and the knowledge that went into producing the data in the first place. And so we all have some sort of records or instructions of how this was produced, whether it's napkin scribbles or some logbook or whatever. Somehow you have to capture that and the discussions that went into producing a physics result. We all have algorithms that are used to analyze the data and to reduce it and to produce that final plot. And we all ran these algorithms on various computers and operating systems. So if you want to reproduce it, you need to produce the capability to compute. And so this is another aspect of this whole problem. So just as an example, let's look at the LHC. So if we have some processed data, then if we do an analysis, the first thing we might do is to sort of skim or reduce the data. Then we might actually run another set of algorithms on this to make a smaller n-tuple. And maybe we did the same thing for some simulated data, so I'm going to combine these things, and I'm going to think about it and do some more analysis. Maybe have some other inputs like crop sections and background information and things like that. And voila, I find the Higgs. And so if you want to actually remember what happened, you have to preserve everything in this box in some way that people can understand it. So if you start with this plot, there's no way that you would understand all the pathway through this. Even if you read the paper, you're not going to understand all of it. So if you want to reproduce it, you need more of them. So I like to think of this in terms of pizza preservation, just to put a picture in your head. So let's imagine that you want to preserve a pizza. And so we're going to translate this into knowledge. So you could go the refrigeration route, which is to preserve the pizza for a short, you hope it doesn't go moldy. And you hope that the time it takes before it goes moldy is long enough. And so you have your lovely pizza, you put it in the fridge, and you hope. Then there's the frozen pizza approach. And so you can keep the pizza in the freezer until you get freezer burn. And so if you want to translate that into preservation, then you could freeze the code, you could freeze the operating system, you could freeze the data for some period of time. And so I will say a little bit later that this is the same sort of procedures that are used for remote computing, and this is a tie-in that dramatically benefits all of these efforts. And then, of course, you can have a recipe. And so you make sure that you can repeat this given the entire ingredients. And so if I want to translate this into, call it protocols, the first one I would call hope. And there's an old adage in biology that hope is not a protocol. And so, this is, we hope things will work out. Most of what we're doing right now is looking at virtual machines and containers, and this is becoming a cottage industry, if you will, more than a cottage industry, really. And so these technologies are really enabling medium-term preservation in a way that was not possible before. And then if we had the ability to store all the instructions and all the code and rebuild everything, that would be more of the recipe approach. Okay, so I'd like to tell you about a project that we've been doing for the past 5 years or so that looks at various aspects of this. This is a multidisciplinary effort that involves high-energy physics, digital librarians, biology, astrophysics, and so we have quite a mix of expertise, and we're looking to achieve some commonality across disciplines in terms of, everyone would like to preserve things for reuse, and so how can we describe the data? Can we describe computation? How was the data processed? Can we automatically replicate this? And then are there impacts of access policies and preservation? And so what we've been doing is building a test technical infrastructure to see if we can really have an end-to-end knowledge preservation system. So I would call this a scouting party in the sense that we're not trying to solve all the world's problems, but we're trying to figure out some pressing problems and some commonality and trying to understand how we can build something. And so we were building metadata specification, looking at a way of specifying computation steps and stringing them together, exploring some query infrastructure. And so what I'll show you is what we've been building, which is the CERN Analysis Preservation Portal, which incorporates all of these aspects into a working system. So let's think about what you need to do to preserve your computation. So you have your executable, and it has a version. And you run it on some operating system, which has a version. And then you depend on external libraries, which have versions. And you might have a config file, which has variables in it, which has a version. You rely on some databases, some external links. And then you have all of that, and then you process some files. So you have a set of input files. You process them, and you make another set of output files, which may or may not have a one-to-one mapping. OK, so now you want to save this. So I'm just sort of pointing out the complexities of this. There are many, many dependencies, and many of them are versioned. And so in a typical LHC workflow, you could have thousands of these running. You may have the same set of things, but then you have 1,000 input files and many thousands of output files. And you could have many of these steps in an analysis. So even if you just wanted to write down the metadata to describe this one computation, it's going to look something like that for just a single step. And so the information to save all of this knowledge and make it searchable turns out to be fairly complicated. As you could imagine just by looking at that it's going to be. And so I'm just sort of pointing out that there's a deep complexity here if you want to put the infrastructure together. Okay, so the sorts of things that we've been working on are capturing computation steps, looking at execution environments, looking at workflows, and metadata. And so I'll say a few words about containers. I assume that all of you know what containers are, but this is sort of revolutionized the way that we think about preservation because we can capture the essentials of the compute step, and you can virtualize the essential features of the compute node, and we put what we need in the container and let the operating system provide the rest. And so this really, since the computations based on this can be much faster, this may be open to argument. This may be a preferred solution compared to virtual machines. But you have to have a container-ready infrastructure, and I'll let Deborah talk about that in the next talk. But one thing I want to point out is that the sort of things that one needs to do to package up an executable and ship it off to the cloud, where you have a completely vanilla machine that you land on, are exactly the sorts of things that one might want to do to preserve it. If you can make that container with your application in it, you can save that container and use it later. And so as long as you can still run it, you preserve that computation. So this link is a huge boon for preservation of computation. But there are really some issues. I think that what I want to say here is the average person doesn't really understand how to use these things. And no matter what tools that you're using that are associated with containers, I think that if you try to hand them off to the general public, you would have chaos. So I think that the current state of tools is really not mature enough for Joe average or Jane average user to use them. And so I think there's some work that needs to be done here. One of the things that this project was looking at was to annotate containers in some way so that you can know what's in them, how they were made, and how they can be reused. And so we came up with this idea of the smart container, where you can attach some provenance and metadata to the image label of the container, and then once you have that, you can say, for example, you have machine-readable labels. You can take these containers, you can put them in some sort of catalog that's linked together with some sort of, I don't know, knowledge graph. I don't know, make up your favorite structure here. But if you had a library of containers and you knew what was in them and how they worked, you could reach out and say, oh, I'd like to use that one, please. And this enables reuse. And so this is a potentially interesting way to go for something like this. Okay. So I just want to show this giant list of workflow preservation tools. I was in a session at one of these workshops where everyone in the room was writing their own workflow preservation tool because no one tool did what that person wanted. And so that's reflected in this proliferation of tools. And I mean, pretty much each one of these is developed for a specific application. Almost none of them, or I would say none of them, work in a production environment that we might want to use if you wanted to, say, do your analysis with one of these. So it would be great if you had a tool that automatically captured the provenance and processing information for everything you did, could bookkeep all your thousands of jobs, allowed you to save what you were doing, and then you could say, well, what was I doing last week? And you could pull that up and rerun it. We don't have that. And so I think that that's an area of work or research, if you will, that is ripe for some evolution. Okay, so now I want to talk about Recast, which is mostly driven by Kyle and his group. And so the idea is relatively simple, and it fits into this whole workflow preservation. So if you have an analysis, you basically have parallel paths where you have some data, you filter it, you reduce it. You have simulated data that you're trying to compare, you filter and reduce it, and you make a result based on your comparison of the real data and the simulated data. If you preserve the ability to run this full chain, then you can swap out different simulations and make new comparisons and get new results. So if you have this framework where you can chain all this stuff together and you can save that, you can reuse this entire set of work, including all the filters and all the thought that went into it. And for example, if you have new theoretical models that you're trying to compare against this analysis, this is a way to do that. And it requires rerunning everything from the basic simulation step through all the analysis code. If you can package this up, then you have a system that allows easy comparison of a fixed analysis with other inputs. Now, as I'll show you in a minute, all of these steps can be put in containers and you can compose them and reuse them. And so that's what we've actually put together. So let me say a few words about what's going on at CERN. So as you probably know, there's the Open Data Portal. And this was stood up a few years ago now. And this is a repository for both outreach data and research data that's open to the public. And so I think all the experiments have outreach data and examples. CMS has released AOD, which is sort of like the process data level. How about half of the actual full data sets for 2010 to 2011, including virtual machines and analysis examples. And just to sort of say there is some evidence of reuse. One of the theorists at MIT has already published 2 papers reanalyzing this data and looking at different jet structure. And so there's a small example of reuse, but it does exist. Now, I would say here that all of the LHC experiments have approved data preservation and access policies. And there's a variety of approaches that people have taken. But it's something that is recognized as important. And clearly, the existence of the outreach in data sets at least demonstrates some small commitment towards this. OK. So then we have analysis preservation. So the new thing that's coming, which is I don't think it's not live yet. At least I couldn't access it from here, so that tells me it's not live yet. There's the analysis preservation portal. And so this is designed for analysts. And I think there's no plans at the moment to make any of this public. But there's an infrastructure that's being built that allows one to save the details of an analysis, including everything all the way down to containers of executables that you can reuse and string together to preserve the full analysis chain. And so the idea is that you could save this, you could retrieve, you could probably, once we get all this stuff done, repeat things or review and compare things. And if it becomes searchable, then in principle you could go through that library of containers that I described to you and pull executables out and compose your own analysis with them. So let me tell you a little bit about this. Let me start with this knowledge map. So, So this is a sketch of the ingredients of an analysis for CMS. And we're basically, so these are all the different things that one might want to save to fully describe an analysis. And so if you just look at this one little piece up here, which just says, what final state am I looking at? And you try to blow up a metadata chart of that to see how you would describe that. You can see it, even if you want to talk about a muon, then you need all of these other things to describe what a muon is and how it was selected and so forth. So again, as soon as you start digging into this, the description becomes very complicated. So is the analysis portal itself, because it has all of these pieces. They're all built from commodity units, but you have a searchable piece. You have inputs from experiments, source code, and data ingestion, and ways of storing the data and retrieving it. And so all of this is being stood up at the moment. And one of the interesting features about this is that there's an analysis backend, which is called Rihanna. And so this is designed to take inputs from analysis preservation or open data or recast, and basically following a set of instructions, which I'll describe in a minute, you can actually stand up the analysis that you saved and run it on a variety of supplied computation, local storage, etc. And so this whole chain is stood up and works. And one of the interesting things about this is that, as I say here, or I've said previously, it was built on a bunch of commodity things, and it supports all kinds of different scenarios in terms of multiple inputs, multiple running environments, different ways of specifying the environment. And so it's a very flexible system, but it has all the ingredients one might want. Okay, and so here's an example of an environment capture. So you have a JSON specification of your workflow, and if you can convert this visually into the schematic, and you can see these things have become very complicated, but all the ingredients are allowed to be specified in a very flexible manner. And you can string these things together. You have different paths. And so each of the computations is preserved in a container. And so you can string them together. You can define the inputs and outputs and how they all link. And so this allows one, if one so desires, to reuse the computation steps as long as they will chain properly together. So this is a really nice infrastructure. And we're working to expand this now to include other workflows in essentially different workflow specification languages in something outside of high energy physics as well. Okay, so the next project, so I like this, I sort of modified this cartoon. There is a disconnect between researchers and data generators and archivists. They don't necessarily talk to each other. And I think one of the pieces that's missing are tools to enable the researcher to preserve and to archive the things that they would like to, such that we could put them into the nice archives that the archivists are building. And so I think this is an area of future focus that should be explored if we're looking at this future of reusable scientific results. So I'll conclude then. I hope I convinced you that this is a complicated and difficult problem, and I think that there are still many tools missing, but there is progress being made on many different fronts. This analysis portal, I think, is really the first end-to-end system that demonstrates that you can actually do this and reuse the different modules. And it's very nice that you can completely reinstantiate all of the computational steps in a way that was preserved within a framework system. I also want to underline that there are many tools common to computation and preservation. So if you can package your thing up and move it, compute on the cloud, you've preserved it. And so that commonality, I think, is something we should also exploit. I think it's also true that ease of use and discoverability are something that's missing. And so that's to be filled out later. But I would come back to this emphasis on reuse. I think the benefits of these kinds of things to science in terms of the ability to have a flexible platform, to be able to take what you did and hand it off to somebody else and let them use it without having to reinvent the wheel. All of these things imply reproducibility, but I think focusing on the further science that you can get out of these systems is a much better way to sell it than just this sort of arbitrary idea that, oh, it's reproducible, isn't that great? So I'll stop there. Thank you.
So Mike, does this have any relation to this collaboration on data preservation in high energy physics, DPE-HEP?
So we've been working closely with DPE-HEP.
Because that's a partnership of all major national labs.
Yes.
So are you a subgroup of that, or how?
Well, this is a separately funded project, but we've been coordinating with DPE-HEP.
Okay, so everything that you do actually is connected somehow to that.
Yeah.
Because I mean, I'm wondering, whether there are duplication of efforts.
No, I mean,
okay, good.
And this is CERN standing this up, so it's certainly not in conflict with anything that DPE-HEP is doing. They're an active participant. And the nice thing about this infrastructure is that it's all built out of commodity things. And so it can be easily transported to any lab or any institution for that matter. You don't need a giant cloud or anything else to do this. The pieces are all available.
Thanks a lot. It's one of the best talk on data preservation I've ever heard.
Okay,
and two things. The first one is the weak chain, the weak link in the chain is really reconstruction, because you have this sort of a black art of which calibration file you use and so on. And so I would like to know whether you agree with me or not on this, because I mean, most of the time, if you want to reconstruct old data, you really have to find the old guy or the old girl, and if you don't find them, there is no way. Having said this, what I was thinking while you were talking is that data preservation always seems to be something that is a priori. Experiment develops stuff as you want, and then some courageous people like you and your colleague, they try to preserve what the experiment has done. It would be much better to put it as a priori requirement. Do things in such a way that they can be reproduced. Yes. By the way, from the how can I say? I would say even moral point of view, if you allow me this, it would be a reasonable requirement, I mean, epistemologically, to do things in such a way that the results can be reproduced. Because, I mean, let's face it, it's a dirty little secret, but the reproducibility of our results, it's highly in doubt. Okay, if the person that has done the analysis, or the person that has done the reconstruction is not longer there, okay, the paper is published, but reproduce the results.
I think that's true, and I think one of the things that we're looking at in terms of how this goes forward is to provide tools. So my sort of holy grail is, let's imagine that I were able to give you a tool that would remember what you did and how you did it and made your life easier. Then you would use it, and magically we would have all that information that would be needed for reproducibility and preservation. Those tools don't really exist, but that's some area that I think could benefit from active development. And so I think that really having these things in the workflow as you start would make life a lot better from all of those aspects. And so I think that I completely agree with you. As far as the reconstruction goes, yeah, I mean, again, that falls into the, I mean, people are looking at ways of freezing data sets and I mean, freezing database data sets and making them available not in a database architecture or something like that for long-term preservation. So there are many links outside of that computation that one has to look at. Will they be available long-term? I don't know. And so that's an open question.
It seems that we start to create another universe of systems specifically for data preservation, where once the computation is stabilized, we migrate it to this other universe. Could you say something on the migration cost and perhaps how to avoid the migration altogether?
So I guess that's an interesting question. Given Kyle may want to comment on this. Given the sort of confluence, if you will, of, let me just go back to containers, for example. The container that you run your job with on the grid, if it turns out to be that's what you're doing, it can be the same container that you put into the preservation system. So I think there's no duplication if that's the mode that we go to run jobs. If you're just running some executable on a disk from your, then there is some extra work there. And so the question is, do you need to preserve that? If the answer is yes, then there may be some overhead. If you're already using a system that you could just mirror it, then there's no extra work. Didn't want to.
Yeah, I think I just wanted to comment a little bit that maybe in response to that, but a different point is that we're worried a lot about the incentives and how you migrate and what the costs are and and things like that, and definitely trying to do it after the fact has been a problem. And the language about reproducibility is this after the fact, post facto, has not been very successful. So we're definitely trying to streamline the actual analysis process itself so that you start capturing this in the process of doing it, and you start actually changing how the analysis is done, and it will kind of migrate into this whole thing so you don't have that so much of a cost in making the transition. So I think the one thing that also added to that is this kind of downstream from this is once you have these kinds of systems in there and they're reusable in this way, you start being able to do this kind of like active learning and combining different things. So there's a whole new higher level type of analysis that becomes possible where machine learning things start to fit into the place because you start using the analyses in a smart way. So it actually enables all sorts of stuff, and it's much more exciting to talk about what you enable by doing this than some kind of post facto auditing. Right. So I think you said it. And I think generally there's a very uniform positive response to that language, and I think that's maybe one of the most important things we found.
Okay. In your very nice association with pizza, actually, I guess pizza is physics analysis, and recipe is a publication. So essentially, our goal is to make a recipe comprehensive. So the publication to describe physics analysis in a way that it may be reproducible. But now, I guess we're putting a lot of efforts into preserving pizzas. Do we really want to preserve pizzas rather than comprehensive recipes?
And so I think there's a cost-benefit analysis to be done there. And so it really depends on how well you think your freezer is going to work, or whether you think in the end the only way to save everything is to have a comprehensive recipe. And so, I don't think there's a straight up answer to that question. If you can write down a recipe that saves everything, and somebody can look at that and reproduce what you did, great. That turns out to be really hard. And so there are approximations to that one can make by saving various pieces and how they were chained together, and maybe that is enough to satisfy most of the requirements. And so I think that there isn't really a clear answer, and it's going to depend on the situation and the ease of which you can actually do that. So, but it all comes down to cost and effort in the end, I think.
Okay, thanks very much.
Thank you.